Hello and welcome back to Run My Arts watercolor tutorial series. So I haven't been doing any landscape painting for a very long time. So today I thought of showing you how to paint a very vibrant looking pink or cool theme sunset beach. Though this is not the actual reference image, I'm just showing you roughly what is the color palette going to be like. And the painting, I have marked at least 3/4 of the upper part of the painting is going to consist of the sky, and the bottom part is going to be beach painting or sea. I'm just marking here as a focal point so that I don't miss the ratio of the painting, and I'll be using Hahnemuhle Britannia cold press watercolor paper, 300 grams per square meter. So about 90% of this painting is going to be created using the wet on wet technique. So as a kickstart, I'm using my mop style Da Vinci Casa Neo brush to pre-wet the entire paper generously with clean water. And I'm going to kickstart the first color palette with a little bit of lemon yellow or citron and some bright red. So you arrive at a very mild looking yellow with a hint of orange tint. I'm using my micro brush and painting a nice looking sunshine onto the pre-wet area using my micro brush. And since this is a pink sunset, so this color, the yellow color mix, is not going to be dominant. So the second color is going to be magenta. If you don't have magenta, then you can mix some basic red shade with a little bit of white paint or white gouache, and you'll arrive at a very pink shade. And I'm just painting it on most part of the paper, since this is a pink, cool pink sunset theme painting. And once done, I am dropping in some violet, and if you don't have violet, you can mix the primary colors red and blue to arrive at your preferred purple shade or violet shade. Just painting that, and please remember these are all done on a wet surface, which is why you need to work quite quickly while the paper is still wet. And if you're unhappy about certain bleeding of the pigment in a certain pattern, then you can use a clean damp brush to just adjust those flowy paint or wet paint. And the next color is going to be sapphire blue with a hint of violet. You can use ultramarine. The reason I mixed violet into this blue shade is because I just want them to match up the color theme of this entire painting, which is predominantly purple and pink. So I'm just dropping it. As I said, your paper needs to be still wet, since this is a wet on wet technique. And once again, I am just adjusting those flowy paint using a clean damp brush. So if you want to make this adjustment, just make sure your brush is not totally wet, otherwise it would leave blobs of stains, water stains. I'm just trying to leave some pigment in the middle part of the yellow stain to create some highlight of the sun. However, I think it was too dry, so I'm lifting out the pigment using my micro brush, a damp micro brush, just rubbing it onto those area and lifting it out by pressing a dry paper towel. I'm doing the same thing towards the bottom part of the painting, which is the sea scenery, where the sun rays would be hitting and creating highlights onto the sea surface. We're going to allow this entire painting to dry completely. And apart from the painting, you should also remember to clean up the borders on the masking tape where the paint residue could still be wet. So if you don't clean this up before you proceed to the next step, those paints can start to stain your painting. So moving on to the second layer, once again we will have to paint this wet on wet. So you will have to pre-wet the paper once again with some clean water. I'm going to drop in some magenta, as I would like to focus more on the pink area of the painting. And as for the top blue shade, I'm not so concerned about that. I'm quite happy with that look. So right now I am painting in a circle like ray around the yellow stain and also extending the magenta once again onto the other parts of the painting. And if you would have observed, the wet on wet technique helps the paint bleed very profusely, which is why it is quite helpful when it comes to painting sky and most landscapes, as in field or even sea. You can even tilt the painting to help the wet paint move further. And over here I'm using my fan brush. You can use any brush that has a hard bristle. I'm just making some paint spatters using some of the violet and blue shade mix, just to create some extra pattern, which creates an impression of stones on the beach sand. Moving on, I'm going to create some light impressions of clouds. I'm using a mix of violet and the magenta, and just dragging my brush to create some long loose lines on the wet painting areas, especially surrounding the sun rays. And since it's wet, it's a pre-wet surface, you can see them bleeding, creating that loose impression of small clouds or elongated clouds. And of course you will have to use a smaller bristle brush, as in script brush or rigger brush, to achieve this fine looking cloud impression. So moving on, I am painting the beach area as well as the sea surface using the same blue shade mix, which was the ultramarine or your sapphire blue shade mixed with violet, and I have also added in a little bit of burnt sienna to darken its value. I'm just painting it loosely in a form of fine lines by dragging my brush left and right so that it leaves gap in between, and those gaps reveals the underlying first layer of painting, which automatically creates an impression of the reflection on the sea surface. And just quickly cleaning up some staining onto the bright yellow shade. Once again, allowing the painting to completely dry. So for the third layer of painting, we're going to make some fine details. I'm mixing some magenta with the orange hue that we had earlier from the mix of yellow and red. And for the first time, we are painting this using the wet on dry technique. So if you notice, I have not pre-wet the surface of the painting. So I'm just applying the wet paint directly onto the dry painting. And after applying the paint using my micro brush, I am using another clean damp brush to give it some light washes to soften those fine lines, which creates the impression of waves on the sea surface. And I've decided to use this magenta paint mix and painting it focused mostly onto the water reflection where the yellow shade are, simply because the reflected areas would have a brighter looking waves. So which is why I am focusing this paint mix onto the yellow stained area or the reflection area of the painting. As for the rest of the sea surface, I've decided to use violet to paint in those other waves impression. And I'm using my rigger brush to paint in most of these waves, since this is a larger paint surface compared to the reflected area. And once again, it's a wet paint onto the dry surface and then giving them light washes using a clean damp brush, similar to the one that I did with the magenta on the reflected area. Once again, using some dark blue shade paint mix that I had earlier to create some impression of the pebbles or stones on the beach surface, as I mentioned earlier. And after applying the wet paint, I'm giving light washes to some part of the paint that I've stained just to create some shadow effect. And once again, I am using the same dark blue shade mix, which appears much darker than the violet, to paint in some shadows or dark areas on the beach area as well as the sea surface. So if you would like to have a much more darker tone, then you can right away use an indigo or add some sapphire to your blue shade mix to arrive at a darker shade. And I'm using my script brush, which would result in an even more finer line compared to the earlier ones that I created earlier on the sea surface. I'm just dragging the brush randomly. Basically, this is dry brush technique where you just take your paint and not reloading it too much with the paint and just dragging it onto the dry paper. Somehow it will create that textures which somehow reveals the lighter and darker values on the sea surface. For finishing touches, I thought of creating some brighter highlights, and in order to do this, I am using the white gouache paint and just brushing it off with my micro brush, especially onto the middle part of the sun in a form of dot, as well as applying it onto the sea surface. You can even create some spatters or dot impressions onto the sea surface to create that reflection effect. I'm also going to extend this white gouache paint onto some part of the clouds where a mild highlight could be visible. So the highlights definitely adds more value to the entire painting, as it creates some sort of a attraction towards that brightness. And if you don't have a white gouache, you can use acrylic paints, gel pen, white gel pen or marker, or even pastel pencils to help you achieve these highlights. So basically this entire painting is not a very complicated one, though the finished painting would give you such impression. It's all a matter of positioning the lighter and darker tonal values as you make your painting. For example, if you wanted the reflection to be in the middle part of the painting, then definitely you will leave a brighter shade onto the middle part or center part of your painting, and the rest of the painting area would be painted in a darker shade, and that's how you create such impressions. You can even create the same impression onto a moonlight painting. Probably you will have to reduce the warmer tone of paints, as in omitting the yellow, or lessen the value of the warm colors, which is the yellow and magenta, and focus more on cooler shades, as in blue, gray, and so on. And the painting is complete. So if you find my tutorial helpful, then do hit the like and share button, and don't forget to subscribe if you haven't. See you in another tutorial. Bye.